Hi, I'm Gillian. As part of the NI Science Festival and as part of the Behind the Sound series, we are delighted to welcome Jonathan Scott, author of The Vinyl Frontier. Jonathan will be talking to us about his book this evening. A special thanks goes to broadcaster Stephen Rainey for presenting the event this evening. If you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button below. Cheers!
Hello, my name is Stephen Rainey. I present a programme on BBC Radio Ulster called Sunday with Stephen Rainey, and that goes out every, you guessed it, on Sundays. It's a tasty mix of news, current affairs, arts and culture, history, politics, science, and everything that's in between there. And with that in mind, I'm very pleased to be chatting with Jonathan Scott for the Northern Ireland Science Festival, whose book, The Vinyl Frontier, sits right at the middle of that Venn diagram of things that my show is about. Jonathan, great to be chatting to you. This is the story of the famous Voyager golden record, the interstellar greeting that NASA attached to the side of the Voyager space probes before they were launched into the blackness of space. But in another way, it's really the story about how we use music and art to communicate with each other.
That's exactly right, and you're right. It's essentially designed as a message that will communicate to any intelligent beings that might chance upon it what us humans get up to. But one of the primary things about it from the beginning was that Carl Sagan, the great American astronomer who helmed the project, was that he wanted to communicate something of our art, and he felt that music had the greatest chance of crossing cultural boundaries. There's a lot of ifs in all of that, obviously, and they all knew that essentially this was a message aimed at us as much as any alien beings that find it, because the earthbound audience was guaranteed. The alien audience is unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole power of the project is that they stayed true to both those audiences, which is why the result is frankly so strange and wonderful.
Well, with that in mind, I mean, what was it that drew you to write about the golden record? It's something that I know as a pop culture artifact has fascinated many people. I first encountered it through the first Star Trek film back in 1979. I was a bit young at that point; I wasn't even born. But there's no spoilers here. But the Voyager probe features in that movie. But for you, where did this fascination with the golden record come from?
Well, I was a child of the 80s, so I was born in the 70s, but I grew up in the 80s when the Voyager space probes were doing some of their, well, Voyager 2 was doing its flyby of Uranus and Neptune. And I was just obsessed with Voyager. I just used to watch and rewatch documentaries about it. So I was obsessed with space. And then, like many an awkward teenager, I discovered music and mixtapes. And became obsessed with those. I was the kind of very obsessive character who would only show even a hint of being friendly. I think, oh, you need a mixtape. Here's another one for you as well, kind of thing. So it was always this area where my two interests of compilations, mixtapes, and space came together. And the thing that really kind of kept my fascination going over the years was that you're right. I think it's sort of gradually become more famous as time has gone on. There was definitely a time when a lot of people had not heard of it, and you would tell people about it, and they would give you that look, that sort of double take kind of, are you sure? because taken out of context, it's such a strange thing for NASA to have done. You know, if you sort of step back from, we all know about the Voyager Golden Record, but really, NASA made a record and stuck it to the side of a spaceship? That just seems really peculiar. And people would just look at me like I was, I was making it up or had got the wrong end of the stick somehow. And it was that over the years just kept my fascination going. Because I'm talking about pre-internet age when you couldn't just go, look, see, they did, So I was always fascinated by it. And then I first got to write about it coming up to the 30th anniversary of Voyager. So 2007, I was writing for Record Collector magazine. And I just wrote a piece, and it was a single page. And the thing that, the one thing that I always tell people that they should keep in mind when thinking about the golden record is its sheer shelf life, in that, in all probability, the two records are going to outlast our planet, which just, blows my mind, and it's just impossible to get your head round. And there was something about that fact, and the fact that I'd just written a single page in a magazine. I just thought, there's so much more to tell. And and then it was coming up to the 40th anniversary, and I just thought, someone needs to write a book about this. It had better be me.
I found a mixtape that I'd made quite a few years ago recently, and the idea of it outlasting all of mankind and the Earth is probably a bit mortifying, to be honest. But I suppose that's a testament to the scale of the project that NASA undertook with this. Now, I suppose to tell the story of the Golden Record, as you do in the book, is to tell the story of the many people who contributed to it. And at the core of this, there's like a sort of inner circle of people who are responsible for shaping what the Golden Record became. Tell me a bit about this little gang of individuals who helped steer this project into what we know it as today.
Sure, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, that the idea that their personalities could shape this object that's going to last forever. Definitely, yes. Well, as I said before, Carl Sagan was the figurehead and the man in charge. He was the one that sort of NASA said, make something to go on the side of the record, on the side of the spaceship. And him and Frank Drake, they were both Cornell professors. So Carl Sagan was already a famous celebrity astronomer. Frank Drake was also famous, but more limited to astronomy circles, as opposed to being a sort of media figure, if you see what I mean. And they were both members of a community called SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. And they're the two sort of figureheads of the project. And then the other members of what's known as the Voyager Record Committee were friends and acquaintances. Carl Sagan's wife at the time, Linda Saltzman Sagan, contributed. Then Timothy Ferris, who was a writer for Rolling Stone, and he wrote about music and science, very intelligent, smart guy, New Yorker, who's a friend of Carl's. His fiancée, Andrea, had a really important role to play. Then John Lomberg, another artist, he had worked on doing some artwork for some of Carl Sagan's first proper best-selling book. And he was a freelance radio producer, and he was drafted in. It was all done for free. These people were working for free, because this was the thing, that the entire budget was $20,000, and most of that would have to go on the actual production costs of the record. So all these people were just working for the honor of contributing towards this project. Have I covered everyone? I think that's the main committee. And then when it came to music, I've got this quote in the book from Timothy Ferris, who was the record's producer, where he describes how there was no czar, there was no one person in charge of what went on, and basically they would meet, they would discuss, they would send each other letters and tapes, and I suppose it's important to say there are different categories of music. They wanted the playlist, Earth's playlist, to function in a number of ways. They wanted it to show off the best of what us humans can do. They wanted it to show off the pinnacles of human composition. They also wanted it to speak for the world, not just for the Americans who were making it. So they wanted music from across the globe. And those are the two sort of important factors. And also, they had a limited runtime. It's only a record. A normal record's got about an hour's space. About halfway through the project, they realized that they wanted to cram more stuff onto this record, so they decided to go 16 RPM, which meant that the final playlist of music is about an hour and a half long. Anyway, when it came to the classical music that they decided to choose, they were all experts to a lesser or greater extent. So Carl Sagan, for example, was a huge Rachmaninoff fan. John Lomberg was a Mozart fan. Timothy Ferris, as I say, was a music journalist. He knew loads about all sorts of music, as did Andrea. And they would sit, they would discuss, they would play bits of music and say, what about this? What about this? And there was no single person in charge. They would just go, yeah, maybe. Yeah, well, that's quite good. And the other factors that were behind the classical music choices was that they not only wanted celebrated pinnacles of human composition, but they also wanted music. Carl particularly wanted to transmit something of human emotion, and there are a couple of pieces where I do believe he really succeeds in that. But the idea they also had behind, they also thought about structure of music. The idea being that imagining an alien audience, even if they can't necessarily appreciate music in the way that we can, they would be able to perceive patterns in the music. So in terms of classical, they kind of kept their own counsel. It's a bit like if I was in charge of a golden record and the subject of rubbish 90s indie bands came up, I'd be like, no, I've got this. I've got some thoughts here. So, but when it came to the world music, they needed outside input. So, but I think an important thing to remember is that this is 1977. This is happening when. So I'm just getting sidetracked. But they got in touch with experts, academics, ethnomusicologists across America, experts in different world cultures, and said, "We're doing this. What piece of music to represent a particular culture would you choose?" And all these suggestions started pouring in. But the thing is, okay, if we were doing it now and someone said, "Oh, what about blah, 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 blah," 2 seconds later, we'd probably find it on Spotify or YouTube. For them, they had to write down the name, a catalogue number, and then try and find it. And some of these records and recordings were really rare. They were deleted records, and they had incredible difficulty tracking them all down. And also, and some of them didn't actually exist on record. They only existed in sort of recordings of ethnomusicologists themselves. Anyway, it's a really fascinating part of the story, how they sort of gathered together all these pieces from various records. And I mean, to give you an example, actually, there was a bloke called Robert Brown was the ethnomusicologist who had loads of input. And one of the pieces he suggested was this raga from India to represent India. And he was really passionate about it, said it's going to be perfect, but they couldn't find it. And it was getting towards the end of the sort of deadline of the record coming together. And they couldn't find it. And they rang him up and said, "Have you got another suggestion? We can't find it." And he just sort of went, "No, keep looking." Carried on looking. They're really running out of time. They rang him up again. Andrew Yan rang him up again and said, "Look, please, have you got a second?" And he just wouldn't budge. He said, "No, it's perfect. Keep looking." And eventually, she tracked it down in a hardware store in Lexington Avenue in a box underneath a card table, and found this copy of the raga and listened to it, and it was perfect. And it's on there. And it's one of the most beautiful pieces I've always. It's by it's called Jahat Kabra Ho. I think that's how you say it, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's really good.
See, I love this. That they're reaching out across the interstellar divide to communicate something about the human experience, but they're also kind of crate diggers for records as well. This team of people were having to kind of get their fingers dirty in tracking down records or copyright clearances or whatever. And I suppose there's something that's always fascinated me about this story is that, with no disrespect to any of the people involved in the project, but this is a fairly hastily assembled team. It's got a sharp deadline. There's all these pressures that they're under. It's a very small window of time and money that they've got to play about with, and it doesn't exactly give off the most, for want of a better word, professional vibe. I can imagine that a team of specially chosen NASA specialists would maybe approach this differently. Does that kind of help how this comes together, that these are not people who have been assembled in a year-long search for individuals to bring them together this project, that this is something that kind of has almost come together by accident?
Yes, I mean, this is my favorite part of the story. Of all that, the theme throughout the story is that, yes, exactly, no disrespect to the people involved, but it does have this sort of almost a homespun atmosphere, and that's partly because once Carl Sagan had his yes from NASA, he wasn't working from within a NASA office. This was a freelance project. They just said, "Go away and do what you." Now they knew that they were going to have to get all this stuff past NASA, so anything too strange, anything too controversial wouldn't make it, and that was a constant spectre over them. But they didn't have an administrator with a clipboard and some tick boxes looking over their shoulder all the time. And I mean, this is what's so beautiful about it. I mean, the fact that it sort of came together in such an organic way is what gives it these beautiful ingredients that are going to last forever. So, for an example, there are greetings on there. Now, that started off as just a thought of, okay, no alien is going to understand it, but this is a global record for us. It makes sense to have a spoken word greeting at the beginning. Fine. We don't want it to just feel like it's an American English project, so we don't want it just spoken in English. Fine. That led to them going, okay, let's go to the UN and record as many people in as many different languages as possible. Again, fine. But that didn't go very well. There were only 5 languages when they did record the UN. There was only one woman speaker, and it was quite long, verbose, sort of, as politicians speak. They go, oh God, what have we done? Then they thought, I know, we'll go to Cornell. A much better idea. Universities full of foreign language departments and students. And then they were really running out of time by this point. So they organised 2 recording sessions, and the greetings are lovely. They're about you can go online and listen to them now. They're about, in total, the Cornell greetings I think are only about 3 minutes long, but they just allow people to say what they like. And these recordings are just fantastic. They just say things like the French speaker, for example, just this ordinary student comes in and just says "Bonjour tout le monde" in this really sing-song voice. There's the Ukrainian speaker. I interviewed a whole load of them, and they all talked about it in this similar way, where they remember it happening, but they talk in this sort of wistful way about this tiny little fragment from the summer of 1977 that's now encoded onto these grooves, these 2 metal discs, 40 years away, and they're going to go there forever. And they all just kind of go, wow. They're a fascinating bunch. The Swedish speaker is a good one. The Swedish speaker says, greetings from a computer programmer in Ithaca, New York, in Swedish, of course. And just so that's an example of something like, oh God, we just need some greetings. So it all came together in this organic way, and because of that, we've got these ordinary people, ordinary students, kicking back in the summer of '77, recorded in something that's going to last forever.
I love that with the project that it sort of snowballs from one thing to another, and it's almost like Carl Sagan and his team, if they wanted to go out of their way to make it more complicated for themselves, I don't know how they could have done that. It's like, let's get all these voices from all around the world, let's have them say something meaningful, let's put it on the space of a record. Let's also put images on this record and have them in colour, and we'll have it do, and just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So, I mean, in terms of, I suppose that comes back to that professionalism thing that perhaps, and once again, I want to stress that I'm not undermining the credibility of Carl Sagan and his team, but the idea that a sort of NASA research team would perhaps look at the limitations of what was possible in the first place, whereas, would it be fair to say that Sagan and his team looked at what they wanted to do and then made it happen?
Yeah, exactly. But that's why it's so full of sort of like hope, and there's something sort of hopeful and optimistic and can-do, very American in lots of ways. They just sort of like kept going, oh, we can cram all this stuff in. And it does mean there's some strange things in there, but also that's what's glorious about it. I mean, when it was Frank Drake that actually came up with the idea of a record, and for him, it was an engineer's solution to a problem. Remember, this was the second message NASA had sent. Carl Sagan and Frank Drake had been involved in the first message, which went with the Pioneer probes in 1972. That's known as the Pioneer Plaque, and it was just a piece of metal about that big, with a pair of naked human figures, a kind of star map, and it described who made the probe and roughly where it came from. Then when 76 rolled round and NASA got in touch with Carl and said, do you want to do it again? This was the sequel. They had to up the ante. And Frank Drake just looked at the Pioneer Plaque and thought, how can we force a modestly sized piece of metal to contain more information? And that's where the record idea came from, because think about it, a record's only about that size, but it's vastly increased surface area because of all the micro grooves. And that's where the record idea, he wasn't thinking about music. He was thinking about how he can squeeze more information onto something that big. And when they first thought of the Voyager Golden Record, they were thinking it'd be one-sided, blank on the back, just one-sided. And they thought they would get about 12 elements on there, a photograph or two, some sound effects, and maybe a snatch of music. That's kind of how they saw it all coming together. And of course, the reality is the final thing is 130 minutes of music, 120 photographs, several of them in color, as you say, a soundscape and greetings. It's just amazing what they managed to cram on there with lots of love, effort, ingenuity, and some doses of slight madness, I think.
It is a testament to what people can do when an idea takes hold like that. But I mean, you mentioned the Pioneer space probe there, and that greeting that they came up with wasn't without its controversy. This idea, the figure of the naked man and the naked woman, was at the time deemed to be a hugely contentious issue.
Yeah, I mean, so it was revealed to the public in 1972, just before the Pioneers 10 and 11 were launched. And it caused loads of interest and excitement. John Lomberg, the guy I mentioned who works on the Voyager Golden Record, he told me how for him, when he first read about this message going on the site, it was like Star Trek coming true. It's like, wow, we're entering this new era when human beings make messages for other beings and put them on the side of space. It just totally, blew his mind. But there was lots of interest, but there was also some controversy, some pushback. The nakedness offended some people. Obviously, early 1970s, it's America's more conservative, slightly more prudish society than it is now, and it can kind of seem laughable in lots of ways. But they didn't like the nakedness. They didn't like NASA being interstellar pornographers. The fact that there's such a small number of people worked on the project, it was basically 3 Americans worked on the Pioneer plaque, and people didn't like that. This was a message for all of us. It spoke for all of us. Why did just 3 Americans? Why is it not a committee? Why is there not an international blah blah blah? Which you can understand. People didn't like the sort of gender bias at work, because if you go and search Pioneer plaque now, you can kind of see the man's doing the waving while the woman sort of is the subservient figure. And also, people didn't like that it gave away our position to attack-minded aliens. Now, that's obviously a very small number of people who objected to that. But I think it's always worth remembering that offended people, angry people, make more noise. I think the vast majority of people thought it was fantastic, thought it was great, and didn't mind the nakedness. But obviously there were letters in, people sort of saying, oh, we shouldn't do this. But the strangest thing about the story, actually, is so if you look at it now, the man is seen there naked with his crown jewels, so to speak, and the woman has nothing. There's nothing there. But there was a line to indicate the vulva, and then at a NASA meeting, a man called Norgal okayed the designs. He thought they were great designs, but he just said, as long as you remove that line, which is staggering. And never fails to amaze me.
I love that proves to be so controversial, but then with the Golden Record, with the images that are encoded, Sagan and his team, one of the images they put in is a photograph of a naked man and woman, which was then altered because that was deemed a little bit too controversial. And it goes back to that sort of attitude of the team of let's just do this, that originally a line suggesting a vulva is deemed too controversial. So they come back with a photograph of a naked man and a woman.
You didn't like
and
that?
Hope that that's going to be fine.
Yeah, no, exactly. The photographic sequence actually became really fascinating during just during writing of the book, because, and I think the reason is, I've written a lot about records in my time. Not one of them, apart from this one, has photos encoded into the record. It's the unique thing. And just very quickly, because for anyone who's listening to this wondering, well, how do you get photos onto a record? This is very in brief. Basically, they had a photo. If you had a photograph that you wanted to put on a record, get an analog video camera, film that photograph, then take that analog signal and turn it into sound and put it on the grooves. So the sound, the record, if you played the record right now, the photographs sound a bit like this. They genuinely do. It's like kind of staticky sound, and there are beeps between each photograph. And it's really strange. I always make this joke, but I always just imagine an alien listening to the record when the photographic sequence starts going. I'm not sure about this one.
Yeah, I don't know how you get down to this piece of music. The Beethoven I can do, but not this one. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of chatting to John Cassani of JPL, the Jeopardy Laboratory at Pardonas, as part of a feature for Radio Ulster's arts program about the Golden Record, and he kind of talked to me about how he was instrumental in this, in sort of suggesting at a very early design stage that we should send a message. But I suppose it's quite crucial that he didn't specify who we send this message to. And as you've said earlier, that the idea that any extraterrestrials will ever find either of the Voyager space probes is highly unlikely. So in a realistic sense, this message is aimed at humanity. And I guess I'm wondering, what was the response of this initially when the probes were launched? How did the public react to the idea that Sagan and his team had they pulled it off? They'd stuck this record on the side of these probes, and that this is what they had chosen to represent all of mankind.
Well, the reaction from the public was similar to the Pioneer plaque before it. It created lots of column inches. People thought it was great. People were very excited. In the immediate aftermath, I think, reading between the lines, I think at the time of launch, NASA was a little bit worried about the Golden Record. I think they thought it was slightly strange. I think they were a bit sort of, you can kind of see evidence of this if you look at the original press materials for the record. For example, one of the famous songs on there is Johnny Be Good. In the original press release, they don't mention Johnny Be Good. They only mention the classical music. Mm. And I think that's a body that are trying to sort of stress the serious nature of what they're attempting here. You know, there's good classical music on here. But I mean, the reaction was still, people were really excited by it. But it's also interesting, like when you watch if you read a press coverage of the Voyager mission, it's at launch, it's mentioned quite a lot, because obviously at that point, Voyager 1 and 2 hadn't done all the amazing things that they would go on to do. So it's the unique aspect of this particular launch, that there's a record on the side. But as coverage continues through the 80s, it's mentioned less and less. It's a footnote that there's a record on the side. A lot of people, there's a lot of misunderstandings, and a lot of people assume that there was a record player as well, which of course there isn't. No, they're leaving the aliens will have to build their own.
Well, let's talk about this for a moment, because whilst, yes, we can all kind of agree that it is unlikely that these are ever going to be found, but let's talk about how this would be received hypothetically if an extraterrestrial life form was to ever encounter it. Now, there's a fantastic little passage in the book that just really struck a chord with me, where Frank is talking about how one of the photographs is of some Olympic runners. Yeah. And in retrospect, he's thinking, is that really the picture we should have used? Because they've got one leg up in the air and they don't appear to be attached to the ground. What if it's conceived that we don't have gravity, or we only have one leg, or whatever it might be? And even the very idea that extraterrestrials would be able to figure out how to build a record player. I mean, if I found the Golden Record at the moment, I don't have a record player that could actually play it at 16 RPM. So what were the expectations of this actually being comprehensible to anyone else but mankind?
Well, that's a very good question. And I totally agree. I'm sort of in awe of the brains that created the record. And I'm not sure I've got the intelligence to make the leap that they're expecting aliens to make. But if you go online now and look at the front cover, so the record was mounted on the side behind an aluminium cover with these hieroglyphs, and these were the brainchild of Frank Drake, who had already spent a lot of time figuring out how one could try to communicate with beings that have no common cultural points. And the keys to the cover are these two circles that represent the hyperfine transition of the hydrogen atom. And that happens over a specific time and over a specific distance. So to the alien that understands what those two circles are getting at, it gives them a unit of time. And then the rest of the instructions are telling them how fast the record needs to evolve, which direction it needs to go. I mean, in short, the idea was that this isn't going to land anywhere. These are going to drift forever. And therefore, to have found the record, the beings would need to be space-going beings. And if they can build spaceships, they should be able to make a piece of metal revolve. But still, yes, I mean, there's another, again, if you go to, I'd recommend any listeners watchers to go to the GPL archives website. If you just search Voyager mission archive, because in there they've got this great diagram that explains all the different all the different bits of the diagram, explains what they're supposed to figure out. And yeah, I mean, it's all part of the for me, it's all part of the magic of the golden record. That it's just how on earth would they figure this out? But it's all logically, it all makes sense. Go around one step at a time. It feels like, I mean, one of their early contributors to the project, there's this early period where they decided they were going to do another plaque. And Frank and Carl got in touch with basically their circle of friends saying, we're doing the Pioneer plaque thing again. What do you think we should do this time? It's like the brainstorm period. And it was Robert Heinlein, the great science fiction author, who kind of made the point, well, we can't know that they'll have eyesight that works anything like ours, or we have no idea what their senses will be. So like anything that uses, we're just making so many assumptions. But I mean, it's all we can do, isn't it? We've got to make a certain level of assumption, otherwise we can't really send anything.
I love that some of the greatest minds that have ever walked the earth have gone, they're logical, and I think it is a fairly logical assumption, is that if you can build a spacecraft to find the Voyager Golden Record, you've probably already mastered the record player. That's already, you can put that to one side.
Yeah.
One of the more kind of esoteric aspects of the Golden Record is that while it does kind of capture this occasionally baffling, occasionally wonderful, a beautiful tapestry of voices and sound and images of humanity, it also charts the story of two people falling in love as well, Carl Sagan and Andrew. And tell me a bit about that, because these are two people who, for them, this record has a different story in a way.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's lovely that this story that's full of science, art, ingenuity also has love in it. It only adds to the attraction for me. And basically, so Carl Sagan and Andrian first met in 1974. Andrian was engaged to Timothy Ferris, and they first met in 1974 at the party of Nora Ephron, writer of When Harry Met Sally. And they would just been, basically, Timothy and Carl were friends. They were just part of a circle of friends, and they would meet up. And in 1976, for example, they were together in Pasadena because it was the Viking, the Mars lander project. So they'd spent quite a lot of time together, and they'd kind of worked with each other before on a TV project that never actually got off the ground for Carl. Then, during the coming together of the record, Carl's feelings were just getting stronger and stronger, but it was an unwritten thing. They were working together, but he wasn't saying anything. Obviously, he was married, But then it all changed when in June 2nd, I think it was, she was actually working on, she had found the piece of music to represent China. The piece that's on the record is called Flowing Streams. It's one of the longest pieces of music on there. It's fantastic. Really good headphones, really loud. I really recommend it. But anyway, she found it, and she just listened to it and just knew it. Oh, this is perfect. This is it. And she, that feeling when you've achieved something important, you want to tell someone. So she called up Carl at a hotel that he was in a conference, but he wasn't in. So she left a message. Then he returned to his hotel room and phoned her up and said something along the lines of this. I came back to my hotel room to find the message Annie called. And I asked myself, why couldn't she have left me that message 10 years ago? So that's him, disclosing, I think about you a lot. You're messing with my head. And then she said something along the lines of, well, I've been meaning to talk to you about that, Carl. Do you mean for keeps? Which is her saying, I feel it too. Are you serious though? And he said, yes, for keeps, let's get married. The phone call ended. She screamed. Then he phoned back about 2 minutes later and said, did that just happen? And she said, yes. So then a couple of days later, they met and went on the Circle Line boat tour around New York. It's a sort of 2-hour cruise that you can take all around the island of Manhattan. And on there, they discussed what they were going to do. And basically, they agreed that because this project was so important, any kind of emotional could sink the project, they would just put their feelings on hold. And they agreed that they would tell their other halves that they'd fallen in love with someone else 2 days, after the launch of Voyager 2. So they just sort of had to keep everything, on hold. But another interesting aspect to this story, so basically they did end up together, and for the rest of Carl's life they were together. So it's a love story with a happy ending. But one other thing about the record is that there's a wonderful part of the story is the sound essay, which is this 12-minute long series of sound effects that paints an evolutionary story of life on Earth. And it's got, within its sounds, it's got natural sounds and sounds of animals. It's got humans, and the humans start with footsteps and heartbeat, and there's laughter on there. But while they were thinking about this, going, oh, well, why don't we go the whole hog and some brain waves on there? Do EEG? And slightly more down the rabbit hole idea, they thought maybe these aliens will be able to, reconstruct their thoughts, which, okay, that's a bit 2 a.m. idea there. Anyway, they decided to do it, and it was Andrew Yan who did it. And she speaks about this very eloquently, but it was 2 days after that phone call, that Flowing Streams phone call with Carl. She was in a medical center in New York, in the Bellevue Medical Center in New York, having her body, her brainwaves recorded. And this was the feeling of being in love, very recently realized love. And that is recorded on the golden record. So for her, there's this added, piece of, this is the other thing. Because when I've fallen in love, I'm normally stuck on like a bus replacement service or something. And this woman had her brain recorded and put on a golden record that's going to last 1 billion years. It's beautiful, staggering, lovely. I should say, by the way, the recording was actually a full hour of her thoughts were recorded, but obviously they sped that up. So if you listen to again, you can go online and listen to it very easily, but if you listen to the sound effects, sound essay, it's right towards the end, and it's this kind of just crackling. It sounds like firecrackers going off.
So, effectively, when it comes to Valentine's Day this year, I'm going to have to up my game a little bit if I want to be Carl and Anne then.
Exactly, and I'm going to want to hear about what you come up with.
Yeah, they've raised the bar a little too high for me there, I think. I suppose that the other side to this all, though, is that it does capture the public imagination, and it is this message that humanity interprets, and what other species can make of it, we'll conceive it. Well, we'll never know in our lifetime, I would say. But in the decades that have passed, is it fair to say that NASA have backed off the idea of using art or music to communicate with extraterrestrials? That's maybe not an idea that has as much currency to them as it did in the 70s?
An interesting question. I would love to. I'd love to get John Cassani involved and see what he thought. But I think some of the missions since. Well, we've been through such a sort of, the financial crash means that now NASA don't want to be seen to be focusing on anything frivolous. So New Horizons, that space probe that did that amazing flyby of Pluto, it left, it was the 5th object destined to leave, human-made object destined to leave our solar system, and that didn't go with anything. And it was, and I personally feel like that's quite a strange decision, because there's no getting away from it. The Pioneer Plaque and the Golden Record really do inspire people, but I'm sure it was down to money and not wanting to be seen to be spending money on anything that wasn't absolutely mission critical. So yeah, I think it's almost whether it's music or not. I think it's messages in general. They're just seeing them as unimportant. I mean, the whole thing is the Golden Record and the Pioneer Plaque, they are a folly. You know, it's going to be 40,000 years before it gets even a light year, within a light year and a half of the next star. This is really slow mail. So I can understand it, but because, I mean, look, we're still here talking about the Golden Record 40 plus years later, which makes me think it's worth it.
Making like a mixtape for someone you love is a tricky enough business at the best of times, and making it's probably a bit of a lost art these days, in fact, as well. Making a mixtape for all of humanity to be a love letter to humanity and a love letter from humanity, I suppose. Having written the book, and it's a fantastic read, it really is.
Thank you.
How do you feel that Carl Sagan and his team get on? Did they hit the mark with the Golden Record?
Well, I think they did. And for me, it all goes back to what I said at the beginning about how they stayed true to the human and an alien audience. Because, yeah, if when I made playlists, I look back at the first mixtapes. I've still got my journal where I wrote down all the songs. And I just thought, oh, God, how embarrassing. Actually, that Irish band, Power of Dreams. Do you remember Power of Dreams?
Oh, I remember them.
Yeah, they're in a lot of my early mixtapes, and all over them, in fact. But anyway, but the point is that, like, you look at it and cringe, and go, oh, God, how embarrassing. But I think the Golden Record is standing the test of time because they took a sort of artistic and scientific intellectual approach to it all. You know, they weren't just choosing the greatest hits. They weren't just choosing music. You know, there are any number of versions of the Golden Record that you can imagine that would have been so tedious. Like if it just ended up being a sort of best classical album in the world ever. Obviously, great music, but just so little to get your teeth into when you come to discuss it. But as it is, it's this amazing playlist where J.S. Bach rubs shoulders with Chuck Berry, where there's the sound of tribes people celebrating the first menstrual cycle of a young girl, alongside the sound of a night chant from Native American Indians. I mean, it's just, and that for me is all down to their ingenuity. And if it had been commercialized, for example, if like a record company had got involved, you know, it could have just ended up being an awful sampler of like 70s pop. Don't get me wrong, I like 70s music, but some of the stuff in the charts in 1977 was awful. So, yeah, there are any number of incarnations. Now, that's not to say there weren't, you know, budget constraints, rights issues, obviously played their part in the playlist. But because they took it so seriously, it doesn't sound like any other record. Pictures aside, you know, the weird buzzing pictures aside, I mean, the playlist is not like any other playlist.
It's absolutely unique, and I do urge anybody who's been listening to us talking to go online. There's so many different places you can hear it, and do hear it for yourself. It's an incredible listen, and I suppose if nothing else, it gave us that fantastic joke with Steve Martin saying that the aliens have sent their message, and the message is send more Chuck Berry. So if nothing else, we can be grateful for that. Jonathan, it's been a real pleasure chatting to you. The book is called The Vinyl Frontier, the story of the Voyager Golden Record. It is such a good read. Thank you so much for chatting to me about it today. And if you're interested in buying the book, it's going to be available at the festival's official bookseller, which is No Alibis Bookshop in Belfast. There should be a link in the chat box of this event. And worldwide audiences, just support your local bookseller, your local independent bookshops. Keep them in business. Check out the rest of the festival. If you enjoyed this event, there's so much more happening. The program is at nisciencefestival.com, or you can follow the festival on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's at NISciFest. And for more video content, if you want more stuff that's happening at the Science Festival, just don't forget to hit the subscribe button below this video. But from me and from Jonathan for the moment, thanks so much for watching.
Thank you very much for having me.